Okay, good morning to everyone. Good morning to our speakers. Good morning to our participants. As of yesterday, when I was checking the registration, we had 313 participants hoping to participate in our first session. Welcome to Pilipinas Conference 2020. We've been doing this for the past 5 years, of course, in a different mode now, using technology as part of this digital transformation, really, in our COVID environment. Allow me to introduce, to start our conference, our chairperson, Ambassador Albert Rosario, former Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Albert.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Pilipinas Conference, which is running on its 5th year. This year, we're holding it under very different circumstances. For the first time, we are not meeting face-to-face. Instead, we are coming together virtually, keep each other away from potential risks brought about by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. For the first time, too, we have 5 half days in our agenda, compared to just 1 day in previous years. And because our conference is virtual, we are able to accommodate more guests. I'm happy to greet our domestic and international audience in this conference, both of the public and private sectors. Although the name of this event is Pilipinas Conference, our coverage goes beyond the Philippines. Since we are all living in a global community now, what happens in the Philippines affects other countries, and what happens in other countries affects Filipinos. Because of globalization, people and nations are interconnected in almost all aspects of life, thanks to the internet and digital technology. The Pilipinas Conference is a platform that brings together thought leaders from civil society, private sector, and government for the purpose of sharing ideas, collaboration, and genuine discourse across all sectors of society. Our interest is to help civil society and the private sector find common grounds with government to forge collaboration for developing sustainable solutions to matters of urgent concern for people in the form of public policy, among others. I thank our speakers and moderators for accepting our invitation at this very extraordinary time. With or without the pandemic, certain things are bound to happen. A few weeks ago, an election was held in the world's oldest living democracy. Earlier, a leadership change also took effect in Japan after a new prime minister was installed. And here, as technological advances are democratized around the world, more people and governments embrace digital technology that in turn leads to optimum efficiency, transparency, and accountable governance. There are heartbreaking situations, though, arising from natural disasters and happens, like the typhoons that passed by recently, which disrupted the social and economic life of many Filipinos. On the other hand, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, certain things did not materialize this year. The Olympic Games in Tokyo was postponed to a more opportune time. The Philippines' upgrade to a higher middle-income economy will be delayed as the country entered a recession this year. Globally, many business expansions have been put on hold until a more positive business climate emerges. And so it becomes necessary for all of us to speak on the same wavelength as members of a responsible community of nations, whether on matters of pandemic control, inclusive development, security, or human rights. Today, we get together to try to anticipate what the future will bring by seriously examining our recent past, where we did right and where we missed out on opportunities. In the process, we need to work together in harmonized collaboration to achieve an inclusive and sustainable economic recovery in the new normal. As for the Philippines, there is a strong need for a whole-of-society approach in dealing with its immediate and long-term concerns, especially on matters pertaining to the containment of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on society and the economy. Like the mature democracies before us, we need to uphold the rule of law in all business, government, and social processes. Hopefully, at the end of the 5-day conference, we shall have discerned well from the events that caught the whole world unexpectedly at the start of the year and brought us all in the bind that we're in today. May we always bear in mind the dictum that those who do not learn from the mistakes of the past are bound to repeat them and pay a heavy price. The Filipino tradition of communal unity and cooperation, summed up in the concept of bayanihan, can help pave the way for a strong rebound to overcome the crises that come our way. Essentially, that Bayanihan spirit has been the secret of our durability as a people during times of immense difficulties. Because of this, we survived and recovered before, and so we will survive and recover again. On behalf of Strat-based ADR Institute, led by our president, Professor Dindo, delighted to welcome everyone to this annual Pilipinas conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario, and thank you so much, ADR Institute, for having me as part of this very relevant forum. And now we'll start the part one of our session, which is on economic outlook. The Philippine economy plunged into recession as the COVID 19 pandemic disrupted what would have been an impressive long term growth pattern. And to start our session for this morning, we have first reviving the Philippine economy, which will be covered by Dr. Ernesto Pernia. A distinguished economist, Dr. Pernia is the former Secretary for Socio-Economic Planning and Director General of the National Economic and Development Authority. He's also a professor emeritus at the University of the Philippines School of Economics. During his stint in government, he helped in developing the Duterte administration's 8-point economic agenda. It was also through his leadership in NEDA when the agency spearheaded the creation of the Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022 and launched the Ambisyon Natin 2040. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Pernia.
Thank you, Karen. Ambassador Albert Del Rosario, Chair of Strat-based ADR Institute and former Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Professor Dindo Manhit, President of Strat-based ADR Institute, honored participants and guests, my distinguished co-speakers in this event, and including the moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all. Yeah, the assignment given to me was reviving the economy, but I thought of a less prosaic title: We Reap What We Sow. And actually, this is more descriptive of what I'm going to drive at later on in this in my storyline. Let me start with please share. Can you move to the next slide, please? Yes. This is the structure of my presentation, which is kind of logical. Where are we coming from? What's the near-term outlook? What's happening? What's being done wrong or less right? And what might be done better? How might we move towards a post-pandemic new world? And for this, I am going to propose sowing to reap in the short run and sowing to reap in the medium to longer run. Next slide. Yes, I start by saying that health and economy are actually intimately linked and interactive. So I prefer to say health is economy. Like they say at the individual level, health is wealth. So at the societal level, health is economy. And so you know that health affects economic productivity and body economy. is going to be bad for livelihoods and incomes. So there's really no trade-off between the two. They're equally vital. One does not have priority in essence over the other, except in timing or order of intervention. In this pandemic, given the Philippines' poor health system capacity, it was natural that the intervention had to first go to the health system capacity. And a lockdown was imposed and eased or lifted in a timely fashion. It should have been lifted in a timely fashion as health system capacity improved. Unfortunately, our government, we started rather late, moved very slowly, and was conservative in spending vis-a-vis our ASEAN neighbors. All ASEAN neighbors, especially 5 ASEAN neighbors, South Korea and Taiwan. Next slide, please. So let me go now to the good and the bad harvests. Next slide. The good. Well, these are the good aspects of what we have accomplished between 2016 and 2019. GDP growth of 6.6% average. Inflation rate was kept within the range of 2 to 4%. We were able to achieve an employment rate of 5.3%, which is rather, I think, in contemporary history, the lowest, an underemployment rate of 14.8%. Lowest poverty rate, again, in contemporary history, 16.6% in 2018 from 23.5% in 2015. And we had good fiscal space, and we had a very good national debt to GDP ratio of 39.6%. We had a good credit rating, BBB+, and we were able to double infrastructure spending to close to 5% share of GDP compared with the past 5 years and even earlier. Next slide, please. Well, I want to show this because this is about, the question is manufacturing growing faster than services? This is an important question for development economists, because development economists are interested in the evolution of the economy, that it moves from agriculture to industry, especially manufacturing, and then to services. In the case of the Philippines, as a national scientist, my friend Raul Fabella has characterized it. We have a progeric or progeria kind of evolution from agriculture and essentially bypassing industry and manufacturing and going right into services. So I was looking at this 10-year period, and we really were not able to get manufacturing grow faster than services, and except in 2014 and in 2017, as you can see on the graph, on the table rather. And the thing is, service sector accounts for about 59% of our GDP. And it has been like that, plus minus 0.1 percentage point, but not much change in terms of the trend line, which is about 59%. Manufacturing has also been steady, rather steady at 19% over a long period of time, and industry about 30%, which includes manufacturing. Agriculture seemed to perform well in the early years, especially during the Aquino administration, Pinoy administration, but later on it started well in the current administration, no, it did not start well in the current administration. It did not start well in the current administration. It was negative 1% growth, and then it was better in 2017, but then again it fell back to a lower minimal growth rate, which is even lower than population growth rate. So this is important. So essentially what Raul Fabella has been talking about regarding progeria is really true that we have just skipped the manufacturing phase of our economy, which is very important because that is the most employment creating sector of the economy, and consequently also poverty reducing and inequality reducing. But we have not been able to achieve that. And that is why we still have a high poverty incidence compared with our ASEAN neighbors. And also we have the highest inequality in terms of the Gini ratio. Okay, let's. So that's the story. So it's not too bad in terms of the numbers, but if you look at the trend, it's not good. Manufacturing has not really, and I don't know if we can still let manufacturing go faster than services. It's kind of getting late, and we may just focus on something different. Maybe focus on the productive service sector, like science and technology, tourism, and maybe we can talk about that later. Next slide, please. Then this is the inevitable bad because of the Taal volcano eruption and then the outbreak of the coronavirus in January. And then, of course, this led to plummeting growth rate in the first quarter, of course, and in the second and third quarter. And so the forecast of the government that we would be registering negative growth rate of between 4.5% to 6.6% in 2020 is unlikely to be achieved now, because to achieve that, we would need the economy to grow at least 2.9%, positive 2.9%. But it is very unlikely because many of the forecasts by analysts and international financial agencies is that GDP growth in the fourth quarter will be rather low, still in the order of -7 to even 11%. And my own calculation, just a guesstimate on my part, is that the fourth quarter will be growing at will be registering negative 5%, which would mean that for the whole of 2020, our growth rate would be negative 8.5%, which is more or less in the ballpark of the projections, the forecasts of other experts or other organizations. So it is not likely that we will be going back to pre-COVID situation in 2021. At the earliest, perhaps in the second half of 2022, we can be probably already beginning to recover in terms of getting back to where we were before. Next slide, please. So the current situation is pretty not very optimistic. We have the sorry reputation of having the highest COVID-19 caseload in this part of Asia vis-a-vis population. Despite the world's longest continuous lockdown, and secondly, the economy is seen as the slowest to recover among ASEAN countries. And I will show that later with numbers again. And I would attribute this story, this SARI's reputation, to differences in health system capacity because I think among the ASEAN countries, we have the weakest health system capacity to begin with. And that's because of severe underspending in the health system capacity in the past. And government, so it's due to the weakness of our health system capacity, as well as government's COVID spending, which was rather conservative. And again, I'll show the numbers later. Considering that conservative spending, considering that we have a large population, next only to Indonesia, and in terms of population to resource ratio, we have a very low. We have a very low ratio of population to resource, and we have the highest inequality and poverty incidence in ASEAN. So that is what I think is not a good thing to have done, to be conservative in COVID response spending. As regards health system capacity, the Philippines has had severely underinvested or undersown in our health system infrastructure, meaning hospitals, laboratories, nationwide. And we have badly taken for granted our health care workers' welfare, such as medical doctors, nurses, and so on. And regarding the economy, the government, as I've said, has been spending rather stingy in spending for COVID response, which has impacted our health system capacity as well. Let's go to the tables now. So these are the numbers that will tell you that will confirm what I've been saying. Look at the Philippines spending on COVID response relative to GDP, the lowest in ASEAN among these 6 ASEAN countries, 5.9%, spending at 21.6 billion. And I was looking at the numbers, and whereas the other countries spent the lump sum in the beginning, I mean a big spending right at the start of the pandemic to stave off the negative impacts on health and the economy. They spent rather generously on themselves, but we have been spending little by little. And the reason for that, I think, is we are trying to preserve our credit rating, and I'll show that later on again. And so, in terms of relative to GDP and relative to population, our spending has been rather pathetic compared with Vietnam, which still has a lower income per capita than the Philippines. Although Vietnam has been growing faster than the Philippines in terms of real GDP, and it's likely to overtake us again. Like what Indonesia and Thailand and Malaysia even earlier have done. These countries were all behind the Philippines in the 70s and 80s. Next slide, please. And so these are the budget deficits as of June 2020. And these budget deficits have moved up since last year, 2019. And our budget deficit is, it's the highest. And that's because of the economy has been contracting the most. And also in terms of debt, government debt or total government debt to GDP, we have hit already 48% from 39.6% in 2019. But that is again attributable to the fact that we have contracted the most among these countries in terms of GDP. And I think by the end of the year, we are likely to hit 51.2% debt to GDP ratio, which is high, but uh, look at Singapore and Malaysia, and you will notice that Singapore and Malaysia have very high credit ratings. Next slide. These are the credit ratings as of October and November in the different countries by Fitch, Moody's, and S&P. And so the Philippines is BBB, which is we are really just middling. We have been trumpeting that the Philippines has a very high credit rating. It's not really all that high. I mean, it's just middling among these countries. And what is really a source of wonder is Singapore, which has a very high debt to GDP ratio. Also Malaysia, they are hitting AAA or A minus. So what's the worry about being downgraded if we spend more? And Thailand is Thailand is even started better than the Philippines, and Vietnam is just a little behind, as well as Indonesia. So there's really nothing to crow about regarding our credit rating. And in fact, credit rating means that we are credit worthy, so we can borrow more at reasonable interest rates. Next slide, please. So the implications of the tables. We are where we are because we failed to spend, or we failed to sow enough. That's why I'm saying we reap what we sow. That's the title of the presentation. So tables 1 to 3 suggest, despite sharply ramping up COVID response spending in 2020, the 5 ASEAN countries, other than the Philippines, maintain their respectable credit ratings based on 2019 and 2020 deficits and debts, implying that credit rating agencies have adjusted their rating norms owing to the pandemic. And the Philippines, and the other implication is that the Philippines could markedly ramp up its COVID response spending, could have or could still ramp up its COVID response spending and still keep its likewise respectable credit ratings. So the fear of being downgraded if we spend too much and we raise our debt to GDP ratio, then it's really unfounded, as these numbers show. Next slide. So let me talk about sowing to reap in the short run. So there has to be greatly increased spending, maybe taken from the infra budget. Senator Lacson the other day was complaining that spending on health is only about 1% of spending on infrastructure, physical infrastructure. So it's kind of, I think we are, putting things in the wrong place at this time. So much increased spending to include investments to fortify our health system capacity, raise the remuneration and working conditions of healthcare personnel, and build or improve social infrastructure extending to the provinces. That is hospitals, laboratories, and even medical schools, which is now being proposed by Senator Tolentino, I think, that we have medical schools in all regions, like UPPGH. And then second point, the second bullet is in spending in this areas of concern are long overdue, will magnify the impact on other economic stimulus measures, such as the BBB program, to include digital connectivity, social amelioration programs, and assistance to distressed small and medium scale enterprises, and also unemployed workers. We really need to spend a lot on these unfortunate sectors of society and the labor force, and sectors of our production system, the SMSEs. Most of the foregoing of the above are covered in the Accelerated Recovery and Investment Stimulus for the Economy, which it has been led in Congress by our colleague in the School of Economics, Congressman Stella Kimbo. Now she is proposing Bayanihan 3, which is really just a smaller version or a part of the Arise, which is around, I think, about 400 billion that she's proposing because of the, in the wake of the 3 typhoons that were devastated. That devastated several provinces and regions of our country. Next slide. Sowing to reap in the medium term to longer run. Foster or strengthen public-private partnerships a la Bayanihan spirit, as Ambassador Del Rosario mentioned earlier. So there has been mutual trust and empathy between the public and the private sector, rather than being adversarial. Sometimes, there's this adversarial stance of the government vis-a-vis the private sector or vis-a-vis NGOs. So this is going to make public-private partnerships more efficient and better coordinated, but keeping them at arm's length to forestall corruption. Such PPPs will ease the demands on the government's the fiscal situation. Government should take on a friendly and collegial, not adversarial stance vis-a-vis the private sector for a unified effort toward the country's development goal. Push for the passage of long pending economic bills, the Public Service Act, the Foreign Investment Act, the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, as well as National Land Use Act. Now that we have these disasters after the string of typhoons, strong typhoons, people are talking about this national land use, the importance of national land use, and also Department of Water. Regarding FDI, foreign direct investment, we have trimmed in 2018 the 11th foreign investment negative list to the minimum that can be dealt with, an EO. The rest have to be addressed by legislation or constitutional reform. By the way, Philippines remains the most restrictive in ASEAN on FDI. For example, compared with Vietnam, which used to be a socialist or a communist country, practically all areas and activities of foreign investment are 100% open. So it's rather ironic that we are facing this Vietnam, a lower income country than we are now, and also coming from being a centrally planned economy, and they are 100% open to FDIs. And then next is to vigorously invest or sow in science and technology and innovation. Philippines spending on this area in science and technology and R&D has remained at 0.16% of GDP since the early 2000, making it the persistent cellar dweller, among other things, in science and technology in ASEAN. Vietnam has spent already about 0.5% of GDP. Thailand is 1% of GDP in terms of spending on science and technology and innovation. 1% of GDP is the norm proposed by the UNESCO, but we are really way behind. We are really a cellar dweller here. Among other things, we're a cellar dweller in many things, but this is important because we should be moving into the Industry 4.0. Next slide. So we need to recoup lost opportunities from our failed population management by fully implementing the RPRH law and adequately funding the National Program on Population and Family Planning to address inter alia, among other things, unwanted pregnancies and stunted children. For instance, the birth rate is expected to increase next year by 17.6%, with 300,000 more or 300,000 babies, which we can call quarantine babies, due to the thinly spread health services, including family planning program. This is a conservative estimate, assuming the impact on the program, the family planning program can be mitigated. Then boldly invest in environment and nature protection and disaster risk reduction and preparedness and management. We should heed the encyclical of Pope Francis, Laudato Si, which has to do with caring for nature, which is our common home. We need to develop a culture or habit of sense of urgency, which I call virtuous impatience. So things get done faster. Again, in ASEAN, we seem to be the most patient and tolerant of delays. Mañana, the mañana habit, puede na habit, thereby making us stubbornly lag behind our ASEAN neighbors. If we do the above, plus other suggestions to be given by our distinguished speakers, we can work on the objective of the PDP, of the Philippine Development Plan 2017-2022, post-pandemic, namely, to lay the foundation for inclusive growth, a high trust and resilient society, and a globally competitive knowledge economy. Thank you, and good day to all.
Thank you, Dr. Pernia. That was truly impressive. I read your past research papers on economics and poverty gaps, and your track record is truly impressive. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is another impressive individual, and he's going to talk about sustaining the green shoots post-pandemic. Mr. Diwa Ginigundo served at the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas for 41 years, retiring from service as the Deputy Governor for the monetary and economic sector. During his stint at the central bank, he led in the development of the government's roadmap in attaining an A credit rating from global credit rating agencies. I'd like to welcome Mr. Ginigundo.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. And thanks for this invitation. I'd like to acknowledge Chair Del Rosario, Professor Manhit, and my fellow panelists this morning. And I'd like to thank Secretary Pernia for making my job easier this morning, because he already laid the groundwork for some premises. Like one, our macroeconomic buffers, the 21 years or 84 quarters of sustained economic growth. I think that is one important buffer. The debt fiscal sustainability issues, I think, are also very, very important. The fact that we have monetary and the fiscal space would allow us to be more sanguine about, as he said, more spending and maximum use of what space we have. And finally, a long list of policy and structural reforms. Now, in the interest of time, let me go directly to my topic this morning, which is sustaining the green shoots post-pandemic. First slide, please. Now, let me reiterate the obvious. We are in deep recession. Year-on-year, real GDP growth for the first quarter 2020 stood at minus 0.7%, minus 16.9% for the second quarter, and minus 11.5% for the third quarter. From the PSA's national income accounts, and this is shown in the subsidiary tables from the PSA, we note two things. One, the economic sectors that contributed the most to the economic contraction were those that required physical presence of our workers: manufacturing, construction, and real estate. By contrast, some positive contribution came from the financial sector and public administration. their workers could afford to work from home. Now, two, on the demand side, household consumption, gross investments, exports, and imports also showed marked decline. They were locked down with the virus. It was good public consumption made up somewhat for the weaknesses of the other demand components. Now, against this backdrop, let me offer a few propositions. Next slide, please. First, there are initial signs of economic activities, although they remain tentative. I would call this the green shoots. Second, because this crisis is pandemic-induced, restoring confidence is very, very crucial. This will help strengthen the green shoots of economic revival and perhaps nurture additional green shoots. This is what Dr. Perna was saying. What can we do to sow in terms of the short and the long run so that we can reap? And thirdly, we have to manage the economic scars of lost jobs, lost income, and lost productivity. And like skin scars, it would take time to heal and disappear. Next slide, please. Now let me go to my first proposition. Yes, there are indeed initial signs of economic activities, the green shoots of economic spring, so they say. Now, 3 of them were cited by the government as early as July of 2020, based on the data as of May this year. They are 1, lower decline in external trade, 2, softer drop in manufacturing output, and 3, expansion in capacity utilization. Now they call this green shoots, but for me, they were not quite at the time. They were flash in the pan. And I can agree today that updates on these backward-looking indicators would point to some promising improvements 8 months into the pandemic. But together, they remain a mixed bag. Now, why do I say that? Now, based on their performance in the third quarter against the second quarter this year, there was a strong recovery in both total trade and production volume. Year on year, however, both of them continued to decline, although at a slower pace. But capacity utilization was actually compressed from 84.3% to 75% in the first 3 quarters of 2019, okay, to the first 3 quarters of 2020. So there was a big compression in capacity utilization. Now, last Saturday, next slide, please. Now, last Saturday, the media reported that the BSP cited the surplus in the balance of payments, inflows in foreign investments, and recovery in overseas remittances as basis for saying the worst is over. I should clarify, ladies and gentlemen, that these indicators have all been captured by the continued decline in poor economic performance in the third quarter real GDP of minus 11.5%. I'm not sure if these backward-looking metrics can be considered as leading indicators for the last quarter of 2020. And Dr. Perna was quite clear about his pessimism about the fourth quarter. Now, let me elaborate. The balance of payments surplus position actually reflect the weakness of the Philippine economy. It reflects the lower demand for imports, which is bad, rather than strong exports of both goods and services, as well as the huge availment of foreign loans by the government as well as by the private sector. Second, actual net foreign direct investment in the Philippines for the period January-August, first 8 months of the year, declined from 4.7 billion last year to 4.4 billion this year, or some 5.6% drop. And thirdly, on cash remittances. Indeed, the cash remittances in August actually reversed some improvements in June and July, down from 2.6 billion to 2.5 billion, or over 4%. Total cash remittances for the first 8 months stood at 19.3 billion, from 19.8 billion last year or a decline of nearly 3%. We hope the September 9.1% bounce back will be sustained. Now, which brings me to my second proposition. Next slide. This hit on the economy is pandemic-induced. As such, it is important that confidence is immediately restored. It would be unrealistic to assume that we have already flattened the pandemic and economic activities are on their way to recovery. A resurgence can reverse any initial gains. Now, is this a reasonable assumption? Yes, because in the US and Europe and some parts of Asia, the virus is coming back with a vengeance. We have to be very careful in the Philippines for obvious reasons. Now, the IMF found that with the prolonged lockdown, there is a very strong incidence of observance of what they call voluntary social distancing in the Philippines. Business and entertainment activities remain weak because people continue to be afraid of the virus and what it can inflict on them. I think this is shown by Dr. Marahar Mangahas's SWS survey of respondents that people are afraid to go out because of the pandemic. Now, what can prove this point about voluntary social distancing? First, I would like to talk about mobility trend indicators. First is Google, second is Apple, and third is Waze. Now, what about Google? It appears to be showing some signs of life. If we talk about Google indicators, turnaround point was between May and June. Next slide, please. However, looking at more granular data, we see that mobility in public transport hubs and workplaces has remained flat. In places of residence, Google indicators would even show a downward mobility. Next slide. In terms of Apple indicators, some slight increase was noted, whether for driving, transit, or walking. But again, they are way below the pre-pandemic levels. Next slide. From Waze, we noted some turnaround between March and April, but down again in August when the strict lockdown was reimposed. But the actual levels were now close to pre-pandemic levels. So this has something to do with what we can expect in the last quarter of the year. Now, since these three high-frequency mobility indicators already cover part of November of 2020, and the picture remains one of limited mobility, we are not therefore too sanguine about the prospects for the last 3 months of 2020. Next slide. Now, let me talk now about procyclicality. Here, I would like to cover liquidity, deposit liabilities, and bank loans and lending rates. Now, what about domestic liquidity? While backward-looking, financial data from the BSP provide us with the additional forward-looking insights. Now, during this pandemic, the BSP did not only reduce its policy rate, and last Thursday, there was another drop in the policy rate by 25 basis points, but they also infused the market with additional liquidity. That's about 1.8 trillion already down in the system. So domestic liquidity continued to grow by around 12.3% as of September of 2020. What about deposit liabilities? Now, people would rather keep their money in the banks rather than engage in bonds, stocks, or even in business. Hence, peso deposit liabilities also expanded by nearly 11%. On the other hand, because domestic demand has gone down for imports, for outward investments, etc., resident FX deposits with the banks also increased by 4.4%. Now, thirdly, about bank loans and lending rates. But banks have chosen to be pro-cyclical. They tightened rather than eased their lending standards in this down cycle, and lending rates remain elevated despite the accommodative monetary policy stance of the authorities. Now, in effect, savers are penalized. And if this is to carry over to future periods, say the last quarter of 2020 on to 2021 and 2022, both capital formation and growth may actually be undermined. Next slide. Now let me talk about business expectations. Here we show the business sentiment from Q1 2016 up to the third quarter of 2020. What do we see here? Now, there are three periods covered here. For the current quarter, which means third quarter, when the survey was done, business expectations showed extreme pessimism, declining from 22.3% positive to minus 5.3%. The first time in 43 quarters that businessmen turned pessimistic. Second, what about business sentiment for the next quarter, which means the fourth quarter of this year? Now, confidence also declined from 42.3% to 16.8%, still positive, but less optimistic on account of the ongoing pandemic conditions. And thirdly, what is the business sentiment for the next 12 months? Now, business outlook on the future of the Philippine economy was also less upbeat as the confidence index dropped from 55.8% to 37.5%. Now, let me go to the next slide. And this is consumer sentiment. Now, what do we see from this chart? Again, current quarter, next 12 months. What do we see for the current quarter when the survey was done? Consumer sentiment turned pessimistic for the third quarter as the confidence index plummeted to record low of minus 54.5% from a positive 1.3%. Next quarter, which means the consumer sentiment for the fourth quarter of this year, pessimism is expected to carry over to the fourth quarter 2020 from positive 9.2% to negative 4.1%. And what about their long-term sentiment among our consumer respondents? Consumers are more confident about the prospects for the next 12 months. But again, this is anchored on the pandemic, mitigation of the pandemic, and restoration of normality in the economy, which means more jobs, more income, and more stable prices. Now, next slide will show the results of the Q3 2020 Senior Bank Loan Officer Survey, which will actually confirm what we were saying earlier, that the banks decided to go pro-cyclical. In short, instead of lending, they decided to increase their loan loss provisioning, which is natural, but at the same time went slow on lending. Now, this would show almost the same portion of respondent banks reporting tighter and unchanged overall credit standards at close to 50% of total responses received. Now, this covered loans for both enterprises and households. Now, results based on the diffusion index or the DI approach indicated a net tightening of overall credit standards, again, for both loans to enterprises and households in Q3 of 2020. So it reflects the procyclicality of the banks, that they are risk averse when the economy actually needs more credit. Next slide. Now, what these leading indicators tell us is that it is too early to claim victory over the deep recession. People are smarting from pandemic. It would be too ambitious to expect them to resume the usual business activities. Now, to me, this is the essence of the economic scars that take time to heal. Savings must have been drawn down. Investments have grounded to a halt. And business activities will be difficult to be put on stream immediately. There are frictions. Output has been lost. Jobs have been lost. Productivity will need time to gain momentum. So now the next question is, how do we nurture whatever has started to blossom? Now, this brings me to my third proposition. Now, since the genesis of this present crisis is the pandemic, whole of society approach, meaning public health, budget, private hospital system, public communication, should be focused on pandemic mitigation, containment, and flattening. Unless this is effectively and credibly done, the economic scars of lost output, of lost jobs, lost business, weak consumer, and business confidence will continue to take their toll on future economic performance. Now, government should demonstrate, therefore, the primacy of pandemic management alongside the restart of economic activities. In particular, as Dr. Pernia pointed out, fiscal policy should be anchored on repurposing some of the 2021 budget allocation, increasing the budget for health and education and infra, of course, with due consideration to actual absorptive capacity given the cycle of the seasons. The digital push on goods and service delivery, payments and settlements, in short, the nurture of the new normal, of the new economy should be pursued. What about monetary policy? Now, monetary policy should guard against itself. It is easy to be carried away with excessive easing of monetary policy and release of extraordinary amount of liquidity in the system because the economy is not doing well. It's in a deep recession. The BSP, to me, has done enough. It has brought down the policy rate to 2%, even as the expected inflation this year and the next 2 years are 2.4, 2.7, and 2.9% respectively. In short, policy rate is now negative in real terms. Now, price stability is not the only mandate of the BSP. Financial stability is another, based on the new law. When we keep interest rates too low for too long, that could lead to mispricing of risks, and we might be setting the stage for asset price inflation in the near future. Now, while we are doing both pandemic mitigation and restarting the economy, we must not let up on the pursuit of policy and structural reforms. And Dr. Pernia presented to us a long list of those proposals, those with something to do with fiscal reforms, anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing, rethinking of the secrecy of bank deposits. This commitment to market-based reforms will contribute a great deal to helping heal economic scars and restore confidence in our economy. I will stop right there, and I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ginigundo. That's super enlightening and really fits very well after seeing the macroeconomic effects and trends looking forward after this pandemic. And now we're going to move on to the topic of two proposals for a resilient and rapid future growth. And for this, we have Dr. Raul Fabella, who is also a national scientist. So Dr. Fabella is an academician, economist, and a national scientist known for his accomplishments and contributions in the field of economics. He believes in the value of conglomerates in poverty reduction and economic inclusion. Having the necessary capacity, resources, organization, and stability, these players are suitable in closely working with the government in the form of public and private partnerships. Let's all welcome Mr. and Dr. Raul Fabella.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm also glad that Dr. Pernia and Diwa spoke ahead of me. In a sense, prepare the ground. First of all, I'd like to inform Dr. Pernia that I've been following the careers of manufacturing and services in this country. And Ernie, during the first year and a half of the Duterte administration that was under your watch, manufacturing was indeed growing faster than services. And that gave me a great amount of hope. I think, however, that the numbers have reversed. and will probably not return to the first year and a half of the Duterte administration performance. My talk will be more long-term in nature, more in keeping with Dr. Pernia's sowing for the long run. I also, so I will be succinct with proposals. And by the way, the macroeconomic landscape has been covered pretty well by the previous two speakers. I also would like to agree with Diwa on certain things. One of them is that the BSP has overdone itself in a sense. We are now in negative real interest rate territory, and the unintended consequences of that is to be careful about as we move forward. We are now in the negative 0.5% territory, and real non-traded goods bubbles are usually the result of this negative real rate territories. Okay, so where do we want to be if we are to reboot the Philippine economy? Well, the end states have already been given to us. Ernie talked a little about it. Perhaps a reduced poverty incidence to 10% from where it was before the pandemic, maybe 16%. Perhaps reduced rural poverty incidence to 15% from about 36%. A $10,000 per capita income in 10 years is probably doable. And of course, we want the economy to be resilient at the same time that it is sustainable. Process targets, the process target is really rapid growth. You cannot have inclusion without rapid growth. So first of all, we look for quantity GDP growth of 6 to 7%. That's covered by NEDA target. So that's not far-fetched. But we have not shifted the economy to an investment-led stance. We are still a consumption-led economy. So we want an investment-led growth. But this was in the original idea of the Duterte economic plan, investment-led growth. We have not done that, but we should. So we should have also an investment rate of between 25 to 30% of GDP, with government outlays at about 8% of GDP. Remember, for the last 30 years, we were at about 2.5% of GDP in government capital outlays. And that really put our infrastructure in a sad state. Of course, we also have to think about rapid growth as sustained, because we cannot have rapid growth that only reflects low baselines. So we need to have to target at least an economy with a trade surplus. Never had we, over the last few years, decades really, had a trade surplus economy. So we need an export growth of perhaps 10% a year. And of course, manufacturing growth for a low-income economy should exceed services growth if convergence with mature economies is to be achieved. this. When talking about rapid sustained growth, one cannot help but mind the achievements of Vietnam today. One can bet one's last peso that not only Vietnam will surpass us in per capita income in the next few years, but as well that Vietnam is on the way to an OECD country or mature affluent economy country status in probably 10 to 20 years. So we should be mindful of what they're doing to achieve the stature they are in. First of all, the government capital outlay in Vietnam has been there and staying there for a long time at 8% of GDP. We are, as Dr. Pernia pointed out, we are a little less than 5%. We actually will be less than 5% because of the COVID. The investment rate is about 30% of GDP on average. The whole investment rate, meaning private as well as government capital outlay, has been around 30% on average for the last 20 years. Ours has been around 20 and now maybe 22%. The Vietnamese economy is a trade surplus economy despite rapid growth. Many countries can grow rapidly, but without a very sustainable trade area, that those rapid growths usually sputter at some point. And Vietnamese economy had a rapid export growth, of course, 16% on average yearly. The pattern is no different than the East Asian economy model. They entered the slipstream industrialization mode, which means entering the slipstream of global MNCs. 7%, by the way, if you enter Vietnam as a foreign investor, you're subject to 17% corporate income tax for your DFIs. Some of that is actually reduced for the first few years. Also, Vietnam has what I call a upward sticky, downward slippery exchange rate policy, or despite its growing trade surplus and growing gross international reserves. So Vietnam has been labeled by the US State Department as currency manipulator. Yes, but if you look at the list of currency manipulator countries labeled as currency manipulators by the State Department, they are a very, very distinguished group. Of course, that's South Korea, that's Taiwan, that's People's Republic of China, and that's India, and now, of course, Vietnam. This is what I consider an example of slippery downwards, but sticky upwards policy. This is the Dong US dollar exchange rate throughout this year. The exchange rate relative to the dollar has actually been maintained, and in fact some depreciation, sharp depreciation in April and May was seen. Now, it's because the the dong is slippery upwards, but sticky downwards. So as a commentary on the dong, despite growth in a trade surplus and gross international reserves, the dong has pretty much kept its value. And despite the currency strengthening all over Asia. This is a credible commitment with export platform investors that the monetary authority has the backs covered. Let me remind you that the corporate income tax for new investments, especially in DFIs, is 10% for 10 years, with 2 years of for 10 years, 17% for 10 years, with 2 years of 2 years free, and for 8% for the next 4 years, before it reverts to 17% in the next 4. The domestic corporate income tax for everyone else in Vietnam is 20%. This is the trajectory of the peso-dollar exchange rate. And you can see that the peso has appreciated considerably from 52 to 48. While that tracks the exchange rate trajectory for most countries, the Philippines, Vietnam has, of course, withstood the herd impulse but in the exchange rate policy. Now, let me talk about another proposal. So the first proposal is simply mind what Vietnam is doing. We can learn a lot from there, as Ernie has mentioned. The second one is the proposal is to incentivize the adoption of renewable solar PV, especially located in rooftops. So rooftop solar PV renewables for corporations. So the International Energy Agency in October 2020 has already stated that for projects with low cost financing that tap high quality resources, solar PV is now the cheapest source of electricity in our history. This is very different from only in 2018 by Lazard Frere estimates, where the best was wind. The second is the lowest cost was wind. The second best is thin film solar PV, then combined cycle gas, and then coal, and then rooftop solar and commercial and industrial. In 2 years, solar PV technology has become the lowest cost in history. So my second proposal is to incentivize rooftop solar PV investment for corporations and for large establishments. This will probably make some people uncomfortable. The Philippines proposes to reduce the corporate income tax from 30% to 25% for corporations. That is gratis et amore. Now, we can create a little bit more investment responsive by making that grant conditional on solar rooftop PV investments. In other words, you shift from 30 to 25 when you employ your idle rooftops as solar PV installation location. Or alternatively, we can pass a contingent idle rooftop tax for the top 1,500 corporations, which automatically gets lifted when the required rooftop investment is made. By the way, rooftop solar PV investment is quick, very quick turnaround. There are now enough solar installers in the country to make it a competitive market. And by the way, solar panels are produced in Laguna, so we don't have to import those. So the second is very simple. It's incentivize rooftop solar PV investment for corporations. Note that rooftop solar PV installations skirt many of the problems of other power installations. For example, no NIMBY problems, no many permitting problems, no environmental. There are, of course, permitting problems with the local governments, but many of the permitting problems are skirted very quickly because there's these areas are already owned by these corporations. The third proposal is also may put people on reservation. The most contentious issue for CREATE is effective income tax rise for PESA exporters, with mandated shift from 5% GIT to 25% CIT. Everyone knows that the equivalent of a 5% GIT by DOF calculation, by the way, which is currently enjoyed by PESA exporters, is 17% CIT. So why not mandate that for PESA locators, instead of a move from 30 to 25, it should be a move from 30 to 17%. By the way, 17% is the current CIT tax applying to new DFIs in Vietnam. And as I've already mentioned, 20% is the CIT for everyone else. I will stop there. Those are modest proposals, and we can discuss them later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fabella. That was very, very interesting. And I personally love the proposal on solar PVs, which I think is very important for long-term sustainability and energy security for our country. And now we're going to move on to another very relevant topic. And we're going to talk about COVID-19 navigating inclusive recovery towards the new normal. And we will have as speakers Dr. Ronald Mendoza, who has recently published a special study for the Strat-based ADR Institute entitled COVID-19 Navigating Inclusive Recovery Towards the New Normal, where he stresses the need for robust investments in healthcare and social protection systems for a more inclusive and stable economic recovery. I hope after this session, we can also talk about how we can read this recent publication. But let's all welcome Dr. Mendoza.
Thank you for the chance to share with you some of our research on the presently evolving COVID-19 health pandemic and the associated global economic slowdown. This is part of our ongoing monitoring and research on this particular set of crises. And the topic for today that I would like to discuss with you is emerging good practices in COVID-19 health pandemic response, particularly those public policies and strategies that help strengthen trust and social cohesion in the crisis response. I just wanted to share some emerging evidence on what seems to work well in other contexts. And of course, the idea here is to try and extract those elements which may be useful for the Philippines in terms of policymaking, in terms of building back better, in terms of strengthening our systems for pandemic response to this pandemic, but also maybe for future risks of pandemic. So one example is Taiwan, for instance, which is well known and recognized for its near 100% health insurance access. It's seen as one of the countries that have a strong response to COVID-19. And probably one of the reasons for this is because even prior to COVID-19, Taiwan already had a very, very strong, very, very inclusive health system. And so the Taiwanese have strong trust and strong inclusion in this system. And it allows their public sector, it gives their public sector a lot of flexibility in terms of the collective action response for pandemic response. The second example is Thailand, and from the emerging evidence on what works in this country, of course, Thailand is also one of the countries that seems to have done relatively well in terms of containing COVID-19. And the emerging analysis is that Thailand, again, also had a very strong and inclusive social protection system and healthcare system, but they also had a very good track record of public-private partnerships, working with civil society groups, particularly grassroots public health activists, who then were instrumental in their COVID-19 response. So this appears to be one of the other ingredients, having an inclusive social insurance system and healthcare system, as well as having a long track record of public-private partnerships. Vietnam is another example, and it's noteworthy because, of course, Vietnam is relatively comparable to the Philippines in terms of level of income and capability to respond to COVID-19. And Vietnam seems to have fared well, despite its being very, very proximate to the source of the disease, which is China. And among the well-noted steps that Vietnam took were early steps in terms of response, as well as mobility restrictions, cutting off travel ties with some of the countries at high risk, in particular China, and then also creating a system of communications whereby citizens have a lot of trust in the public sector and were voluntarily sharing personal health information in a government-launched app called nCoV. So it emphasizes that Vietnam has a system of capturing information while still protecting the rights and privacy of their citizens, so that this information can be used to better respond to the crisis and inform their policies in an evidence-based way so that they are much more effective. Vietnam also has been able to tap its citizens in a form of collective action to provide the relevant information for crisis response, in particular, very strong online messaging to trigger collective action by citizens in support of the government's response to COVID-19. Finally, there is the example of South Korea, which is seen by many as one of the countries with a very strong test, trace, and treat system. And if you look back at the background of South Korea, it actually had relatively weak responses to MERS and SARS, which were previous health risks. And South Korea has learned from these previous challenges, and so built the relevant systems in order to prepare it better for the next pandemic. And so, of course, that is the starting point for South Korea when COVID-19 broke out. And it was in slightly better condition to manage the present pandemic that we're experiencing now. So among the key elements of the South Korean response, of course, is the very strong test, trace, and treat system. It has a very credible and strong mass testing system, and of course, a contact tracing system that is also seen as a standard for many other countries to learn from. And then it also has built into its healthcare system the capability to rapidly realign and build a surge capacity, so that in case you have challenges like what COVID-19 suggests, COVID-19 will pose, that the healthcare system can develop the absorptive capacity to respond adequately. Now, since you asked about the potential constraints, I will very candidly outline some of the main constraints for countries like the Philippines, which may have populist tendencies. And of course, I'm alluding now to governance. Innovation and technology is one thing, but of course, the political, social, and economic environment will shape whether these innovations, whether to what extent these innovations and technology will be effective and will actually be adequately provided and supplied. So my argument here is that you have an ideal, which is collective action, but you also have the reality for many countries, which is populist tendencies. So I'm going to juxtapose one form of management against the other in order to emphasize the point that it's going to be a governance constraint, not a technology constraint for many countries. And I would posit that's the case for the Philippines. In collective action, you want an emphasis on social cohesion. In populism, you actually have very, very divisive rhetoric, which is the complete opposite. So if you wanted to build a very strong collective action response, that's not necessarily what populists deliver in terms of their style of management. What you want in collective action, strong collective action, is expertise and evidence, the science, the medicine, medical expertise, and everything as far as pandemic response. But under populism, what you have is an anti-complexity bias, an oversimplification bias, and of course, the observation by many that the populism thrives in an almost post-truth world, where there is not necessarily a respect for expertise and evidence, and almost always an oversimplification of many complex issues, and an adherence to shortcuts. In collective action, you want trust building for voluntary behavioral change, and effective collective action at the individual level and at the community level. In populism, there tends to be a bias towards punitive and coercive approaches. Not necessarily voluntary, it's based on punitive approaches. And there is also the risk of high degrees of disinformation, which again is anathema to well-informed individual behavioral changes that could help produce what should be more effective collective action. So the conditions that populists thrive in and maybe even contribute to are not necessarily conducive to the type of trust building for voluntary behavioral change that we would like to see in effective collective action. There's also this issue of respect for individual rights, which is probably what feeds into high levels of trust under ideal scenarios of collective action. But under populism, what you have sometimes is the use of the common good as a false justification for trampling rights. So this is unfortunate, of course. We've seen this in many other contexts. The drug war is one example, but also in terms of anti-oligarch sort of rhetoric and some efforts to level the playing field while also eroding institutions. So this is the institutions and rule of law, I should say. So this is part of this populist style, which may not necessarily be respectful of individual rights and rule of law. And finally, collective action is based on systems-based solutions and institutional reforms to sustain more effective collective action, not just in the present pandemic, but maybe as a future response to other types of risks and crises, including the future risk of other types of pandemics. But populism is well known for the end justifies the means type of approaches, and also extra legal approaches, which don't necessarily strengthen institutions. So in a nutshell, these are what I see as the governance constraints for more effectively generating the innovations and technology that will be underpinned by trust in a more effective collective action scenario. Let me end on a more positive note on what I see are some of the key elements that countries like the Philippines can build on in order to facilitate a more inclusive recovery from a pandemic like the one caused by COVID-19, and as well as the global economic slowdown. First element that we're seeing from international evidence is the use of technology. So this is really the main theme for today's discussion. It can be for rapid testing, apps for tracking, real-time information sharing, telemedicine, but also more broadly in terms of creating the platforms for inclusion in the types of information technology that we are now seeing as useful and critical in the new normal. In fact, I would propose that maybe COVID-19 will trigger new national discussions on access to the internet as a national public good. Essentially, given the means to access the internet and to interconnect, you will actually have a more adaptive, more resilient society to these types of shocks, and certainly to the shock that we are now experiencing in the world. And so I think that's one bucket of the first set of components for inclusive recovery. The second bucket has to do with trust building, which you need for compliance, such as with mobility restrictions, lockdowns, with quarantine, and the willingness to share information and the confidence to know that your privacy and your rights will actually be respected, even as the aggregate information becomes useful for more effective business strategy or for more effective policy responses and collective action. So you give up some degree of privacy for the common good. On the other hand, you balance that with some institutions, some institutional innovations to protect the rights of citizens. And of course, what this tends to contribute to in terms of the environment is a strong environment of trust, social cohesion, and that is also underpinned by an environment of no discrimination. So these are the elements of an environment that populism is not necessarily well known for. And of course, that does suggest that there has to be, in order to have these types of innovations in types of institutions, there has to be some governance, innovation, and progress as well. And finally, I would suggest transformation of the brick and mortar healthcare system, and maybe even the social protection system, and maybe even some parts of the education system and other types of human interaction. And as you are transitioning to the new normal right now, there could be some innovations, some reforms that will tend to stick even in a post-COVID-19 world. Even if we did have a vaccine at some point and some degree of normalcy were to return, maybe many of the innovations we introduced during this period will actually tend to stick because of their cost effectiveness, because of their increased inclusion, but also because it makes us much more resilient to future shocks. I would emphasize as a last point this issue of inclusion, which will be critical because as far as we see the pandemic and the global economic recession that it triggered may have a very unequalizing effect across societies, but also within societies. And so it will be critical for our policy responses, for our innovations, for our technologies to focus on this element of inclusion because it will be critical in terms of facilitating much more inclusive recovery, but also the right type of governance that supports that recovery and resilience in the longer run. Thank you very much for the chance to share these inputs in today's discussions.
Thank you, Dr. Mendoza, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government. And now that we've understood at the macro level all the factors that would affect our recovery from this pandemic, we move on to the micro level, specifically at the household and individual level. So, part two, where we will proceed right now, is on public opinion or surveys amid the COVID 19 emergency and beyond. And this is very important because the general public bore the brunt of the unprecedented crisis brought about by the COVID 19 pandemic. And so, understanding the public opinion on the impact of this crisis will give policymakers a deeper appreciation of the urgent options that need to be undertaken. And to start off on part two, uh, we will talk about surveys on inclusivity of past and future trends in the quality of life. And for this, we have no less than the president of the social weather stations as our speaker. And we have here Dr. Mahar Mangahas, and he will talk about numbers, particularly economic data, which have many stories to tell. However, such figures fail to wholly capture the reality on the ground, the experiences and perceptions of the ordinary Filipino. In the recent months amid the COVID 19 pandemic, the social weather stations, headed by Dr. Mahar Mangahas, conducted various surveys relating to the past and future trends in the quality of life. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mangahas, who's the president of the social weather stations.
Good morning to all. We can put it to the slides already. I greet you all, but not going to spend too much time on that. Inclusivity, we have empirical measures of what inclusivity is. Let me say, first of all, that this is not opinion of people about something else. This is the reports of the people about themselves. So these are, no, who else can have a better opinion about themselves than they themselves? So they should not be denigrated as opinions. These are facts, facts reported by people on the ground. Next slide, please. And these we have been gathering for a long, long time. This is a series of surveys which SWS has done since the 80s to the present. These are not opinions. These are what people have been saying to us as to whether they have gotten better off since last year or worse off since last year. If better off, we call them gainers. If worse off, we call them losers. Now, if you look at this 35-year series of data, you'll see that there were more losers than gainers before 2015. For all that growth of GNP, that was non-inclusive. How can you have inclusive growth if most people are getting worse off, not better off? However, fortunately, luckily, starting with 2015, growth was inclusive. This is remarkable and very good to see. More people were getting better off than worse off starting in 2015. So this is not the current political administration alone. This started in the middle of the last administration. But of course, it was all gone by the time of COVID, right? This 2015-2019, by the way, this has a counterpart in the Banco Central's confidence surveys. But of course, that only started 5 years ago. What we are showing you here is a series that started in the mid-80s yet, which is just to show that inclusivity is very new. It was not there before. This is counting people. This is not counting value added, mind you. Right? Let's go to the next slide, please. Here is a slide of net gainers. So we've just compressed the gainers and the losers slide to show the net position. And here you can see very clearly relative to the zero, which is zero net gainers, that the inclusivity started only in the last several years. Before that, there was barely any. There was a little bit in 1986, but then it submerged all over again. And so we must look at the last years from 2015 for this inclusivity. Let me say right away, what do we have in the last 5 years? To me, we have benign inflation. That's very, very important, because you have a chance for wages to increase in real terms. And secondly, let me point this out, in the last 5 years, since 2009, you have conditional cash transfer. Conditional cash transfer is the very, very first targeted government program, targeted to the poor by means of data. For all the pro-poor remarks in the past decades, it's only with CCT that we had a targeted program. So this is why I think this is very important to see why growth became inclusive recently. Next slide, please. Now, inclusivity didn't start at the same time for everyone. This is a breakdown of net gainers by educational group. Here you will see, using that dark green line, that there were already positive net gainers for college graduates beginning in 2010 up to 2019. So growth was inclusive for college graduates already starting in 2010. It started later for those with less education. In 2015, growth started to be inclusive for high school graduates. And that's that yellow or golden line over there. So in a way, if there are people who had a better training, took advantage of inclusivity earlier. But the elementary graduates and those without with less than a high school education, they started very, very much later in 2017, 2018. So the starting point of inclusivity is not the same. The higher your education, the more you are included in inclusivity, right? Let me repeat, this is not opinion. This is what people are saying about themselves as to whether they got better off or worse off compared to the past year. And inclusivity requires at the minimum that more people are getting better off than are getting worse off. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, when we survey, we ask people, did you get better off than last year? But we have a second question. Do you expect to get better off next year? Or do you expect to get worse off than last year? So the trends are both looking from the past and looking towards the future. And those who say they will get better off, of course, we call them optimists. And those who say they'll get worse off, of course, we call them pessimists. And most of the time, there are more optimists than pessimists, but not always. Here, the green lines are the optimists and the reds are the pessimists. And you will see that optimists prevailed over pessimists in the 80s and in the 90s, but in the 2000s, they were about equal. And sometimes pessimists were even more. Optimism became inclusive when you have more optimists than pessimists. Again, also approximately in the late 20,000s. But definitely by 2010, you had very inclusive optimism. It got larger and larger. But of course, as you see at the very end, it drooped. It drooped very much. In fact, you had more pessimists than optimists. Except here, this last points here, 32% optimists and 30% pessimists. That's the very, very latest SWS figure of September 2020. when you have a glimmer of optimism there, +2, a glimmer of optimism of people for the future. That's a good sign. Let's hope that that continues. Next slide, please. This is the net optimism. It's the same slide as previously, except we've just netted out the pessimists from the optimists. So you can see there that the extreme optimism, extremely inclusive optimism from 2009 to 2019. It was kind of weak from the 2000s up to 2008, not really that strong. Of course, everything collapsed in 2020 with pandemic. And as you see there, a little +2 at the very end, that is September 2020. That's not public opinion, mind you. That is reporting of the people about themselves. All right, so it happens to come from a survey that has a general views about other things, but when you're talking about themselves, that's not mere public opinion. That will not change. There's no way of changing that when the people are talking about themselves. Next slide, please. Now, we, of course, relate gaining / losing to optimism / pessimism. Right? What's the connection between where you came from and where do you think you're going? And of course, this is very, very natural. Gainers are always more optimistic than losers. People who say they've just gotten better off have a more sanguine view of the future than people who've gotten worse off. See here, this is from 2019 to 2020. Net optimism of the gainers, that's the top line. Net optimism of the neutrals, that's the yellow points. Those who say that nothing happened to them and they're still optimistic about the future, nevertheless, but not as optimistic as the gainers. And the losers, those are the red triangles. The losers are also optimistic about it. We're also optimistic about the future up to December 2019. Even if they had gotten worse off, they were still optimistic about the future. However, in 2020 itself, the losers also became pessimistic about their future. But a little less so, such that by September 2020, they are practically almost neutral. But see the big difference. Gainers +46, unchanged +17, losers -4. Of course, these gainers +46, there are very, very few of them. Very, very few people say they have gotten gainers from that. I think those are people who are in the business of transporting, delivery service. These are the people who've cornered the testing equipment market, who're selling tests and things like that. All right. Very, very few gainers. We've got to have more of them in the future, of course. So you've got to try to do something about how many people get better off and how many people get worse off. Count people. Don't count value added. Count people. Don't look at sectors. That's production. That's value added. Look at people. Next slide, please. Well, you've seen some of this already. This is the relationship of optimism to education. College graduates, optimistic about this. This is September 2020. This is COVID time already. High school graduates, a little bit optimistic, but the elementary and the non-elementary graduate, definitely these are negative, right? So it's not equal. The opportunities are not equal. And if we do, by the way, if we crunch the educational system, we're going to make it less optimistic for people. We've got to maintain the schooling of the ordinary people in order to boost up their optimism. Next slide, please. And because I promised that we'd do something about job holding, there is a connection, of course, and people who have managed to keep their jobs are optimistic on a +5. those without jobs, whether they used to have them or never had one, those people are, of course, the pessimistic ones. Right? There's a very tiny net optimism of +2. Next one, please. All right. Now, this is a different kind of optimism. This is economic optimism. This is the question of, do you think the economy will get better off? Not yourself. All right. So this is already, you might call opinion. All right, because this is not looking at yourself. This is looking at things around you. And this is look at this chart, which shows that you had actually economic pessimism up to approximately 2009 or something like that. At that time, there were actually more economic pessimists than economic optimists. People who said that the economy is going down. Not me, but the economy is going down. Right? This is very common, by the way. In Europe, we had so much economic pessimism. People always saying the economy is getting worse, but me, I'll probably make do and I'll get better off. So it was very good when there was a turnaround, a shift around, and economic optimism became inclusive starting in 2010. Starting in 2010, all right? This all vanished, of course, in 2020. And we have 2 surveys about this so far in the pandemic of 2020. And you still have pessimism above optimism of the economy, not about themselves, about the economy, -5. -5, right? Now, these ones, I see Diva there watching. This is the point where we can make a correspondence between the Bangko Sentral of the Philippines surveys about confidence, business confidence, right? That should have started long, long ago. But this is my way of showing the consistency of our work for the past 35 years, but only now is there some government survey activity to corroborate what we've been saying all along. Now, I'll make some policy comments maybe after this. Let me go to our last slide. I don't have words. I think I just have, yes, yes. This is important. The economic optimism is positive in NCR and Balanced Luzon, very negative in Mindanao and the Visayas. This, I think, is very important. We must put some geographical aspect to our knowledge of the economy, right? NCR and the Balance of Luzon, right? Now let me kind of editorialize already here about what I think is the proper policy. I think that the government should let go. I think it should let go of the jeepney control and the tricycle control. I think it should let go of curfew. These things have nothing to do with the pandemic, I think. They have to do only with controlling the people. This goes line in line with the populism control that Dr. Ronald Mendoza was talking about. It's a self-inflicted damage to the economy. Let go of the ordinary transportation. Let go of the curfew so that people can work and go back to their jobs. Don't, for goodness sake, don't get money from the conditional cash transfer. That's the worst thing that you can do. There's a proposal in Congress to take money from CCT and transfer it to Ayuda. So that's the worst thing you can do. The CCT has helped us all along these past 6 years. Use new other monies for the Ayuda. Don't rob the CCT for the Ayuda, right? And most of all, just keep track of sectors, not value-added sectors, keep track of people. Where are they, like geographically? How do they go back to their employment? If you're going to look track of value added, then you're going to start looking at finance. Finance is not a sector of people. There are very few people actually in the finance sector. There are very few people in property. You know, what are the main things of people? You know, retail, huh? Ordinary commerce, like that. Let people move around. Stop checkpointing them. To me, this checkpoint thing has, to my mind, is one of the worst ideas that we have been doing. I've been saying that from the beginning. Let the jeepneys go. Let the tricycles go. Let ordinary people go. In fact, you need them just to get your statistics, right? Or else you will not even know what's going on. We've got to get back to inclusivity, which we already had since 2010 or 2015. Just restore it. Restore the inclusivity. That's my message here. Maraming salamat sa inyo.
Thank you, Dr. Mangahas. It was very insightful to hear about people's reports about themselves, about the quality of life. And you really gave very practical pointers for policymakers on how to improve the quality of people's lives during this pandemic. And now we're going to move on to talking about measuring the public pulse for a robust democracy. And to talk about this, we have Dr. Ronald Holmes, who's the president of Pulse Asia Research Incorporated. Pulse Asia is grounded on the belief that measuring the public pulse is an essential ingredient for a robust democracy to thrive. With this, Dr. Holmes, president of Pulse Asia, will be presenting the most crucial socioeconomic, political, and cultural concerns of Filipinos amid the ongoing pandemic. Welcome, Dr. Holmes.
Yeah, I'll just unmute myself. Good morning to everyone. To all our panelists, it's good to follow from the macroeconomic and the last presentation of Dr. Mangahas. I'd like to thank Stratbase and congratulate them on the holding of this 5-day Pilipinas conference. Then the title of the session given to me is to measure the public pulse for a robust democracy. I'll try to speak on my own assessment of whether the country is really in a state, whether our democracy is really robust. But I'll try to focus also on some other things that our surveys have produced for us with regard to measuring the public disposition towards politics and government in general. And I would speak not only as a Pulse Asia Research Fellow and President, but I will also speak using my hat as a political scientist and a member of the Academe at De La Salle University. So when we released the last survey, this was in September 2020, this is the result of our first face-to-face survey in 2020. The reaction coming from the public can be referred to as some were shocked that after a long lockdown with the deleterious consequences of the lockdown to the economy, the highest incidence of joblessness, a significant drop in terms of the economic growth. I think it's about 17 percentage point. Some people were asking us to explain why is it that the president continues to enjoy quite a huge majority trust and approval rating, as shown in this chart compared to the previous presidents. The President Duterte has enjoyed higher majority trust and approval across his administration. But this is not distinct to him. We've seen basically one other president sustaining his trust and approval for a significant duration of the administration, and this is the former President Benigno Aquino. Although admittedly, the trust and approval of former President Aquino was lower, his highest was at 80% trust and 79% approval, compared to 91%, the highest posted trust and approval rating of the current president. So the reaction is something that we more or less anticipated, but it was a little bit much more intense, especially those who were critical of the survey results. As I've expressed in different fora in the recent past, we do just convey the results of the survey. We stand by the integrity of the survey. And this is something that more or less shows a snapshot of how the people view from their own personal perspective, the performance and trustworthiness of the president. This leads us to a question that I think many of us should be able to answer in this forum, whether the Philippines is indeed a democracy. We do understand that our role is to provide a more systematic method in terms of generating what the public feel about politics and government. It's scientific, it's systematic. The results are based largely on following the norms in the social sciences. And in studies that have been done, in surveys that have been done about democracy, Dr. Manga has, if I'm not mistaken, in the social weather station survey, many Filipinos, like in our own surveys, 71% believe that the Philippines is a democracy. And the level of satisfaction with democracy in the Philippines remains consistently higher, although it's much lower than, let's say, the level of satisfaction that is posted in other countries in Asia, if we use the Asia Barometer surveys. So, but there is that question, are we really in a democratic state? And surveys would indicate that majority of the Filipinos do believe that the Philippines is a democracy. As I said, in our 2010 and 2016 surveys, 71% believe that the Philippines is a democracy. And there were many reasons that they stated why they think that the Philippines is a democracy. More specifically, I think the polarity in our 2010 survey, if I can recall, stated that it's because of the equal application of the law. There are, however, people who say that the Philippines is not a democracy. As a political scientist, I know that our political system has many flaws, and I would argue even and assert as a political scientist that it is a procedural democracy with very serious deficiencies. But the perspective of the public is different, and I cannot in any way substitute my own perspective from the perspective that we generate from my own surveys. There, however, quite clear signs that we are having manifest threats to our political system right now. And that's the reason for this image, as you see, that I used in this particular slide. Perceptions that the freedom of expression is heavily curtailed, that the rule of law has been applied more or less selectively over the past few years. Our own survey showed that Filipinos do believe that democracy is a more preferred alternative. One of the questions that we have asked longitudinally is a statement, and we ask people whether they agree or disagree with this statement. If we work with this specific slide, you will find in this slide across the last 20 years, the level of agreement or disagreement towards the statement of whether it is necessary for martial law to solve the many crises of the nation. And the level of disagreement that we find in the current survey is such that you have a sizable majority, that is 65% of the public, saying that they disagree that martial law is necessary. What is quite noteworthy, however, with this particular survey is that if you look at the Mindanao perspective or agreement or this level of disagreement, it is simply 1 out of 3 disagreeing with this statement. And what we've seen in the case of Mindanao is a greater agreement with the statement that martial law is needed to solve the many crises of the nation, more specifically after the Marawi siege. And this is seen in this next slide here, where the average level of agreement with this statement in Mindanao was highest in March 2019 at 67%. And this is by far quite different from the level of agreement that was posted at the national level. Let me just emphasize that this is just one item that measures really the extent by which people subscribe to that indicates the preference of people with regard to democracy versus a non-democratic form of governance. In the more sophisticated questions that have been raised in the Asia Barometer survey, the work of which I think the survey work was done, if I'm not mistaken, by social weather stations, you'd still have a majority of the public basically preferring democracy at any given time. About 1 out of 4, if I can recall, are saying that authoritarian systems may be preferred under certain circumstances, but this is a constant that has not increased to the extent that it's a significant plurality. So as one indicator, again, if you just go back, you do have majority of Filipinos saying that it is not necessary for martial law to serve to solve the many crises of the nation. Uh, One of the more disturbing things that we saw in a survey that we conducted in June 2017, and I note here what uh, our friend, Dr. Ron Mendoza, said was one of the many things that you can say was effective in the case of Vietnam, when people were sharing voluntarily information about their health to government using a government app. When we ask Filipinos what political activities or what activity they engaged in the past year, you do have only a small proportion of people selecting among certain options that were given to them. And a large majority, 85%, said that they did not engage in any of these activities. Now, whether this is an indication of political apathy or whether this is what some people in the past referred to as another proof or evidence in terms of people power fatigue, what we do see in the Philippines is that, at least based on the survey, what we do see in this survey is that you have a more than 8 out of 10 not having engaged in anything that is political, including, let's say, a simple posting or reaction to a social media posting on politics, which is just about 6% in this particular survey. Um, so this is, as I said, we have not repeated this one. We were hoping that we could repeat it. We might reconduct the survey or use this question again in future surveys. But this shows that with regard to other forms of political participation, with the exception of elections, Filipinos tend to be a little bit less active or tend to be inactive. Um, as I requested the organizers, the other thing that I would speak about would be basically just to ask a question of what we can expect in the next couple of years. Some have already mentioned that what can be expected in the next couple of years is that you will have the circus back in town, and it's a political circus. And that circus involves largely preparations for the 2022 elections. And I think right now you do see a number of politicians making their presence felt, issuing certain statements and making declarations about their intent, hoping to get some form of support, not necessarily from the public, but from people who would provide them material resources for their own campaigns. What we see in our survey is that people are still truly interested in the elections. If there's one form of political activity that you cannot take away from Filipinos, which is shown, which is proven by this survey, and all our other surveys, is that the level of interest of Filipinos in an election that will be held more than almost 2 years from now is about 8 out of you have 8 out of 10 Filipinos who are interested, and you have half of the public truly interested in the forthcoming elections, and about 3 out of 10 somewhat interested, and the level of disinterest is low. A social scientist pointed out before that this is the domesticating aspect of electoralism, but nonetheless, what we can say is that if there's any attempt towards not holding elections, there might be a public reaction against that particular proposal because Filipinos are truly looking forward to an election in 2022, regardless of who will be running. The other point I'd like to raise is that Filipinos think that elections do help promote democracy in the country. And you have about 70% of the public saying that the conduct of elections have promoted democracy in the country. And these are the survey results from 2010 to 2019. We do surveys, but we also do other forms of social research. The last point that I'd like to raise is that in many other forms of social research, we're able to dig deeper in terms of the public pulse. And this is a challenge to many other social scientists to continue to do surveys and other forms of social research, including ethnographic research and other forms of qualitative research for that matter. Maraming salamat po and good morning.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes. That was very insightful and really relevant, considering that in 2022, this will be the first time that our country will go into elections post-pandemic. So we've already finished all the topics that we're going to cover in part one and part two. And now that we're going to the open forum where we can ask questions from our panelists and speakers, like to give a recap of who will be here with us to answer questions. And we have Dr. Ernesto Pernia, who's the former Secretary of the National Economic Development Authority and also Professor Emeritus of the University of the Philippines School of Economics. We also have Mr. Diwa Ginigundo, former Deputy Governor of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. And we have Dr. Raul Fabella, who's a national scientist and a member, it's also part of the National Academy of Science and Technology. And Dr. Ronald Mendoza, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government. Dr. Mahar Mangahas, who's the president of the Social Weather Stations, and Dr. Ronald Holmes, who's the president of Pulse Asia. So we'd like to open the forum for questions and answers. Okay, I will go to the Q&A forum because we've had people sending in questions as early as 9:27 a.m. So we'll start with a question of Mr. Dindo Danao. And for our speakers, any one of you can take on this question if you find this relevant to you. And the question is, so what is the desired roadmap for Philippines to economic recovery amid the COVID-19 pandemic? So for any of our speakers, if you want to answer this question, you can just unmute yourselves and address this question. The desired roadmap for the Philippines to economic recovery amid the COVID-19 pandemic.
I can repeat what I said a while ago. And that's just in the first place to let go of unnecessary restrictions to the economy. Let go of curfew. Let go of the rules about jeepneys and tricycles. Let go of the ways whereby people cannot go back to their ordinary hanap buhay. Those are completely, I say, unbased on research anyway. They have nothing to do with infection. You have to prove first that there is infection before you start changing, restricting people like that. And to me, that's so unfair to the ordinary people. As compared to the people with cars who went out without restrictions and could do their ordinary thing. That's so exclusive to restrict transportation like that.
Thank you, Dr. Mangahas. That's a very straightforward answer and also very doable for a lot of our policymakers to just implement right away. Do we have any other answers? Okay, we can start with Dr. Mr. Ginigundo.
Yeah, well, I agree with Dr. Mangahas. There are things that should be considered lifted because they do not promote any kind of positive action on both pandemic management and economic recovery. But I would like to emphasize the broader context that it is primary for the government to show that pandemic management receives its priority alongside the restart of economic activities. The crisis is basically pandemic induced, and therefore the civil society expects no less than a good efforts on the part of government, and of course with the support of the private sector, for us to be able to flatten the viral pandemic. For this reason, let me again, in the same spirit of Dr. Mangahas, reiterate for me that fiscal policy should not be timid in this particular issue. Second, in the case of monetary policy, I think the BSP has done enough. What is now important is to monitor and also talk to the banks to avoid procyclicality, because you need credit, but you also have to assure that access to credit is available to both households and business. And when we are doing that, of course, in the same spirit of Dr. Pernia, I think we should continue to pursue those very important policy and structural reforms. I think the name of the game is confidence. And we can only build confidence if the people are confident that their government is doing something positive and effective for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ginagundo. I see Dr. Pernia raising his hand. Can you?
Just a very quick intervention. I think we have this beautiful word, bayanihan spirit. If we live by that spirit, the bayanihan spirit, especially government vis-a-vis private sector, vis-a-vis the whole citizenry, and among ourselves, if we have more mutual trust and confidence, mutual trust and empathy among us and between us, I think we can do better. And during the COVID, the outbreak of the COVID, the private sector was really very spontaneous in contributing to the requirements, the materials needed for COVID, food as well as other consumables, and even contributing to the setup of quarantine centers and testing centers. And there was little coordination between the government and the private sector. With better coordination, I think this public-private partnership and cooperation can really be more fruitful, and we should sustain that, because that is the meaning of bayanihan spirit. And as I have said, we just need to sow where so we can reap. And I was talking about we need to spend. Not in little, in little installments, but we need to, from the beginning, we should, or even now, we can still spend enough to really get things going rather than bits and pieces of increments here and there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pernia. We're going to move on to a different question, and I think this will also be addressed by Dr. Pernia, because one of your slides talked about this surge in the population that I think you referred to them as the quarantine babies.
Yeah, actually, the real increase in quarantine babies is about 2.5 million babies, quarantine babies.
Okay,
And
that's
if that is added to the population without screening, who really should be added and who should not be, because they are not quarantine babies in the sense of being born because of the lockdown, or being the couples getting babies because of the lockdown, then it's about 45% increase in our population for 2020.
That's a very, very interesting development that our country has to face. And this is related to a question from Mr. Gary Olivar. He's asking, why are we still pushing family planning when everyone credits our young and large population for the demographic sweet spot? That is our best hope to progress.
Yeah, but then if we are not going to manage our population, we will have so many stunted children and unwanted pregnancies, which should be provided for by the government, by the family planning program, so that women can have that number and spacing of children that they want and they can afford. If we don't do that, then we are just going to have more stunted babies, and when they grow up, there is not much for them to expect. And this is what our Asian neighbors did. Thailand, all the other countries had good population management. And this is a lost opportunity, because in 1970, we were about 37 million people, same as Thailand. And we started family planning about the same time, 1970. But then Thailand sustained the program. We did not, because of so many objections from the Catholic Church hierarchy and other conservative groups. And so we really did not get that population family planning program going. So we are now 110 million. Thailand is only 70 million. That's about 40 million difference. And in terms of poverty incidence, our poverty incidence is more than double that of Thailand, 16%, 16% in 2018. Thailand is about 8%. So it's a problem, it's good to be talking about young population. It's going to be a demographic dividend, but you cannot have that demographic dividend if you don't have quality children who are brought up in a quality fashion in terms of nutrition, education, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pernia. Our next question is for all speakers. The COVID-19 pandemic is forcing companies to relocate from China to Southeast Asia to diversify their respective supply chains. What do you think is the most practical strategy for the Philippines to attract the right foreign investors, especially those from the manufacturing sector, for a more sustainable economic recovery, aside from usual policy changes at the soonest time possible?
Can I start?
Of course, Dr. Pernia.
I would open up the Philippine economy to 100% or close to 100% open for foreign direct investment. Of course, we can choose which ones we want and which ones we don't want. But now we have too many restrictions. And that is why we just have trickles of foreign direct investment compared with Vietnam, compared with Thailand and Indonesia. So why are we so hesitant in opening up the economy? I think this protectionist mentality was a carryover from the time of in the early post-war period, the Recto and the Tanyada, this protection and the those guys, this protectionist mentality was just carried over, and they think that by being protectionist we are more nationalistic. No, it's false nationalism, as far as I'm concerned, to be protectionist. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pernia. Anyone else from our speakers on this question? Dr. Fabella?
Well, Vietnam came up in three panelists' talk. So it's interesting. Vietnam has, of course, succeeded in attracting tremendous amount of interest from foreign investors. And this year alone, Vietnam garnered about $8 to $9 billion in foreign investment, whereas we lost. So there's a tremendous difference. But the ecology that Vietnam offers to foreign investors is very different from ours. First of all, in terms of just pure policies, Vietnam offers 17% CIT to new investors. This country is actually increasing the income tax on foreign investors from 17 to 25%. Secondly, the Vietnam policy with respect to the exchange rate is very, very robust. Vietnam is simply saying, we cover your backside. We cover your backside. It's not a matter of depreciating the dong. It's a matter of resisting attacks from the outside about your exchange rate policy. So that's what I call it's slippery upwards, but sticky downwards policy. And of course, Vietnam has been putting on the putting on the table new infrastructures that are quite interesting. Vietnam has 8% of GDP in terms of government capital outlay versus ours, which is a little less than 5%. And of course, Vietnam is able to, being able to attract direct foreign investors is a reflection of this ecology that it is able to present. Not just one issue, but an ecology of investment that is really very attractive to foreign investors. And that precisely rule of law. For example, rule of law. In the Philippines, we have had episodes where the political center has threatened to deprivatize some PPP projects that have served us very well.
Yeah.
That noise is not helping our capacity to attract foreign investors. It's simply saying, beware, you invest for the long term in the Philippines, and the political center might simply say, no more. So that is a very different type of ecology that Vietnam presents to the whole world. Of course, Vietnam's capacity to control COVID is another important selling point. But even before COVID, Vietnam has already had a tremendous attraction to foreign investors. So being able to slip into the slipstream of multinationals, global multinationals, is a very important strategy, which was actually also followed by the People's Republic of China earlier. And the problem is here, CREATE is going to actually reduce or increase the income tax for. So the reason why I want to make CREATE a little bit more responsive to investment. Now, there is an issue that is interesting here. It was called Bayanihan by Ernie. It's called countercyclical behavior by Diwa. And it's called social cohesion by Ron Mendoza. All these are very nice, but they're aspirational. Normally, banks as well as businesses will behave to preserve, to serve their own profit motives and bottom lines. That is why a long time ago already, John Maynard Keynes made it clear that what perhaps lowering the interest rate as well as lowering the income tax on corporations is like pushing on a string. It is like pushing on a string. In a crisis, you should be pulling, and that is the basis for the position of Ernie as well as Diwa. That fiscal stimulus, which is generally demand pull stimulus, are the better way to go, rather than the supply side stimulus. So if we want, because Bayanihan as well as countercyclical behavior as well as social cohesion is probably not going to happen overnight, we might as well make corporations earn the 25% CIT. Why give it to them gratis et amore? Make them earn it by pre-investing in, one of the things that I mentioned is reduction in cost for themselves if they don't want to invest in new capacity. then, but they should be investing in reduction of the cost of current production. And that is why I said perhaps government should incentivize rooftop solar PV installations before they become qualified for the 25% CIT. Government should, in a sense, nudge the private sector towards a counter-cyclical stance with respect to their spending. Because left to themselves, BSP will experience the fact that the growth in loans will still be very, very slow. I guess I've said more than enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fabella. That was a very comprehensive answer, from taxation to rule of law to also what we should all consider following the best case example of Vietnam that's comparative to our country. And this next question is for Dr. Mendoza. Many medical professionals have opted to work overseas instead due to the low pay and unsatisfactory compensation they get here in the Philippines. If the local healthcare system is improved, do you think this will be enough for these workers to be enticed to continue working here in the country?
Thank you for that question, Karen, and whoever posed it among our colleagues listening in. I think, let me begin by saying it's interesting that if you ask a group of economists what the solutions are, all the solutions we pose tend towards economic solutions, and we are facing a health crisis right now, actually. So I think one thing we should clarify is we should fix the health crisis in order for us to recover in an inclusive way. And even though many of our solutions that we talked about today are important, I think the primacy of fixing our health system certainly needs to be on the top of the list. And this question, where in fact, just today, there was a decision to let some of our health workers begin to go abroad again. So basically, the ban has been lifted. I think 5,000 health professionals are now allowed to go abroad. And if this is a war, then we're losing the main fighters in our war, because they're going to fight in other fronts, not in our front. And so this is quite troubling. One of the proposals that we were exploring is to look at the healthcare industry as a sunrise industry for the Philippines, dovetailing into our plans to boost our tourism industry, dovetailing into our plans to boost our human capital in this particular sector in terms of higher value-added BPO services, because you can have medical transcriptions and other types of services linked to it. And so I certainly agree with the person who asked. I think he's trying to lead us there, or she's trying to lead us there. This could be part of our Build Back Better, make our healthcare system a lot stronger, build it towards global competitiveness, and make it inclusive for most of our people, if not all of our people, because right now this is the risk. I agree with Mahar that we should have greater mobility at this stage, but if our healthcare sector is not able to absorb a sudden upsurge of COVID-19 cases, then we're going to be an on-again, off-again type of recovery. And we're going to send a negative signal to all investors very quickly that we are unable to handle this crisis because of the weakness of our systems. So I really think one of the hypotheses we should pose as economists in this crisis is that isn't this a test of all our institutions, particularly in health, particularly in social protection, and particularly in education, in terms of the inclusiveness of these systems? Because if they are not inclusive, then we will remain vulnerable to this kind of crisis. And what kind of a signal are we sending to investors when our branding globally is high human capital and competitive young workforce? When in fact, all it takes is a COVID-19 to shut down our primarily services-oriented economy. This is the big question, I think, that is hounding many of us right now, and certainly hounding me. Uh, Let me also add, even though this is partially answering a previous question, yes, we should boost the healthcare industry. And yes, we should begin to open up our economy. So I agree very much with Secretary Pernia. He knows we are among the allies in terms of opening up our economy. But along with that opening up, we need to build stronger institutions so that we don't open up blindly and create the political pushback that will stop that opening up. What do I mean? Well, right now, there are questionable investments very near some of our naval bases, actually, which raise issues of national security. And these issues have been raised by this very think tank, ADRI. And it, again, makes me think that, yes, we are economists and we would like the economy to grow. We would like to invite investors over, but we must do it in an evidence-based way and in a guided way by regulatory institutions so that we don't end up giving up on some of the other policy objectives that we have, including in health, but more importantly, also including in national security. So I think this is part of what may create a negative pushback against such a laudable goal of opening up the economy, creating investments, creating lots of jobs. If we don't want that stopped, we have to set up the institutions to protect that strategy in the longer term.
Thank you, Dr. Mendoza. And now we have so many questions coming in right now, but in the interest of time, we'll push this up to 11:45. We'll have room for about 2 more questions. This one is addressed to all the speakers. There is a need to harness technology for inclusive recovery and to keep up with the trend of digitalization. However, with the country's lack of adequate digital infrastructures, how can this be maximized? So this is a very interesting question because Dr. Mendoza was earlier addressing the lack of human capital. And now we're moving on to infrastructure, particularly digital infrastructure. Dr. Mendoza? Yes,
yeah,
of course.
may I? Okay, I was waiting to be called because I'm well behaved that way. So anyway, I think I mentioned it in my presentation that we probably have to enter into discussions of considering internet access as a national public good at this stage. I'm looking at some of the data right now. 10 million workers unemployed. Mostly these are not workers who can work from home and have little work insurance. 2.7 million students dropping out of our education system. They did not enroll during the last enrollment cycle. And in fact, our structure is such that we have a high vulnerability to this pandemic type of situation. So structurally, if we were able to gear our economy into a structure and system where we are less vulnerable in this way, even as we are a services-oriented economy at this stage, and even as we're trying to boost manufacturing, but I have some thoughts on that in terms of boosting manufacturing yet relying on robotics, because I think there's a lot of signals out there that robotics is actually the way to go in terms of many of the manufacturing investments today. And robots don't get sick from COVID-19, by the way. So this is part of also the lessons emerging from other countries. But I do think that in terms of building human capital, let's discuss a few investments that are ambitious and may actually take us to the next level of competitiveness, which may include discussing access to the internet as a national public good. So I think that's a very basic discussion.
What else? Mr. Ginigundo?
Yeah, I agree with Ronald that internet is a public good. But in terms of priority, I think we can also pursue a digital push in terms of our public health. One of the reasons why Vietnam was able to contain the pandemic was its good use, very good use of technology in pursuing testing, tracing, and quarantining, as well as treatment. So that even as you ate noodles from a noodle house up to the time that you reach home, they have a good tracking system. Why? Because of the digital push with respect to their public health. I think doing this in the public health management it should be prioritized. Second, of course, is health and education. Education, because right now education is pursued on a remote basis. So doing this and providing our children, the students, with enough support on the digital side, I think is the way to go. That is not only in terms of making sure that education is pursued even during these pandemic times, but also pursuing what we need to do to be able to contain the primary problem of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ginigundo. And for our next question, I'll be combining two questions that were sent by our audience. One is this talks about the private sector having a long experience and expertise in doing certain things that the government should have been doing, so they could be very helpful as partners following the whole of society approach. But then again, they might end up doing basically the same government functions. In what areas can we define the limits of what the government should be doing and what the private sector should be handling? And in relation to this, we have another question from our audience that asked, and I think this could be addressed by Dr. Ronald Holmes and Dr. Mangahas, how do we communicate and engage civil society with private sector's cooperation in assisting to promote a more proactive environment, not just to recover, but also to allow us to see the current situation as an opportunity? So yeah, two questions. One is like the limits of what the private sector should be doing and what the government should be doing. And then from another of our audience's questions would be on how do we engage civil society in the private sector, and more so to see this as an opportunity post-pandemic.
Yeah.
I will.
Yeah, let's
Okay.
say.
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Pernia and Dr. Fabella. Yes.
Just very quickly, I think in terms of division of labor between public and private sectors, that can easily be done, because there are certain things that the private sector does and does it well, and the government usually has to confine itself to providing the favorable investment environment and the rule of law and public goods. So, in fact, and if there's a need for fine tuning, who does what, then there should be coordination. There should be consultation between the public and the private sectors. I mean, why it should be that easy? It's just needs the political leadership to call the private sector and then discuss what is the best for them, for the economy and for society. So that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Pernia. Dr. Fabella?
Actually, many of the good news in the Philippine economy in the last 3 decades has been associated with public-private partnerships. Take, for example, water distribution in Metro Manila. That happened because that is now delivered by the private sector to concessionaires, namely Manila Water and Maynilad, because of the 1997 concession agreement that these activities be pushed towards the private sector. And as it turns out, this is a very important and interesting development, because water service apparently is very much within the expertise of a private sector. All the complications, it's very complicated, by the way. And the state just doesn't have the capacity to do that properly. It can do that, but it cannot do that properly. So that is a very important thing. The other thing is, I tell you, is that due to the EPIRA, we have actually pushed most of the power sector in this country in the hands of the private sector. And that has done us a good amount of good. And I think that there is also the question of the government pushing towards the private sector the provision of gasoline in this country by the government simply living off OPSF, or Oil Price Stabilization Fund. That ended in the mid-90s. And all these things contributed to the government having solid fiscal positions, which then it enabled it to turn around and give this fiscal bonanza towards the most needy in terms of transfers, conditional cash transfers, which Mahar made much of, and with which I agree completely, and which the 30 administration, by the way, has scaled up, and that's a very good thing to do. So there are many instances where government pushing activities where it doesn't have comparative competence to the private sector has done this country a great good. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fabella. What about the second aspect of this question in terms of engaging the private sector and civil society? Dr. Ronald Holmes, earlier you showed in one of your slides the reluctance of people to engage in political activity. Do you have any insights on how people could be engaged, especially in a proactive way, and to see this post-pandemic as an opportunity?
I think part of the problem really is what Dr. Mendoza had already pointed out. There's this collective action problem that we continue to face. There's probably a lack of trust in terms of government in general, in terms of whether it can address a particular issue. This is separate from the trust towards personalities. But I remember one study that has been done that looked into assessing Philippine civil society. And one of the limitations really is that there are not that many civil society groups that are actually bridging organizations, meaning that they link citizens with government. Most civil society organizations are bonding organizations. They tend to bring together people of the same interests and cater to their mutual needs, rather than to make themselves felt in government and to lobby government to address more collective problems. And the main reason for that is because of the failure to organize sectors continually, specifically after the political transition in 1986. So I think it begins really with sustaining the political organizing that really strengthened civil society groups earlier and has been neglected over the past 34, 35 years after 1986.
Thank you, Dr. Holmes. We have so many questions left, but in the interest of time, we can't answer all of them. But one also question that was frequently asked is there going to be a recording of today's forum? And to answer that, there would be a recording. So go to the Strat-based ADR Institute YouTube channel if you want to watch this or you want to share this with your friends and colleagues. And so we'll have to close the open forum for now, and we're going to move on to the closing remarks to be given by the president of Strat-based ADR Institute, Mr. Professor Dindo Manhit.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, to our speakers, panelists. Always great to listen to respected scholars, practitioners. On this session of the Pilipinas Conference, Rebooting the Economy Post-Pandemic, or Cushioning the Long Emergency, here in Strat-based ADR Institute, we spoke of a long emergency. And we have seen that since the declaration of the global pandemic. We have seen that since the lockdown of March 17 and the consequence or the economic consequences that has really affected not only the Philippines, but the rest of the world. we have seen the Philippine economy's future turned from a promising start of 2020 to a bleak and uncertain by mid-year. Our traditional growth drivers, such as consumption, remittances, and services, all declined. And we have seen data from government up to the third quarter. It was shared by some of our speakers that when you look at the GDP growth rate, we have seen this decline. And this emergency situation brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic will likely persist in the coming months. And here in ADR Institute, we look at crisis as an opportunity. That this type of crisis, this long emergency, might be able to pave the way for sustained economic growth. And I heard of our speakers talking about experiences, success stories from our neighbors. So can we learn from these success stories that the Philippine economic growth that has been traditionally consumption-led can create an opportunity to start to shift to a more investment-driven economy? We are in a period of uncertainty, but there's an opportunity to tap into other sectors and to change the national strategy for sustainable growth through long-term investment. And here I speak not only of opportunity to attract the right foreign investors, but even local investors investing through PPP. With our inherent competitive advantage, the Philippines can compete from a position of strength in global trade. I see an opportunity in a global supply chain because here in Strat-based ADR Institute, we've been asked by different multinationals to look at this opportunity for the Philippines as they move outside of China. And the Philippines cannot return to its pre-pandemic normal. That's why even in the Institute, we have organized this Filipinas conference to look at 2021. The need to craft policies and frameworks that can attract the right investors, both local and domestic. And through these investments, inclusive growth can be attained, as emphasized by Dr. Mohar Manghas, creating jobs and providing stable incomes to the people as the Philippines heads towards a new normal in 2021. Again, thank you for joining us in the first session. Recordings will be shared, and we will be hoping to see the 235 participants that joined us today to join us again tomorrow. Thank you, and good morning to all.